The year is 1990. Fog creeps over the sleepy streets of Cape Ann, Massachusetts, a quiet coastal town where the lighthouse blinks steadily through the mist. The low, distant sound of waves breaking against the rocks drifts in through the half-open window. Inside, Michael stands pressed to the glass in his daughter's old bedroom, feeling how heavy the air becomes in a place where someone is missing. It has been 22 years since Julia disappeared. The wound still feels as raw as during those first confusing weeks after her high school graduation. Nothing in her room seems to have moved since then. Movie posters are still tacked to the walls, notebooks covered with sketches and clippings scatter her desk, and the closet is filled with clothes she never took with her. Every item has turned into a silent landmark of all that never happened. The prom dress never worn again. The stack of records she'd once played every Saturday morning. Now, as the fog settles in the corners and blurs the world outside, Michael tells himself this has to end, yet for a moment he doesn't move. It almost feels like if he stands there long enough, Julia might step out from behind the door, rolling her eyes, asking if she can drive into town with friends. The past hovers in every shadow and behind every memory. But next to him, Carol waits, steady and quiet, her expression saying enough. She has carried her own ache silently, agreeing with Michael that they cannot let the room keep defining their lives. The two had talked about this for weeks, knowing it was time to pack away Julia's things, to accept finally that she would not come back. The decision isn't really about old clothes or dusty books. It is about taking one step away from the impossible hope that things might be undone. Still, inside Michael, there is a stubborn sense that hope is not entirely foolish. He wonders if this last act, the clearing of her room, might release something, maybe let him breathe again, or let Julia's memory belong to the world outside that window, not just here in this frozen place. Even as his hands start to move, folding a sweater into a box, he feels that familiar tug, the wish to step outside and begin searching all over again, refusing to leave even the faintest light unturned. The process of sorting through Julia's things starts off slow. Michael moves carefully across the room, setting aside boxes for what to keep and what to donate. It takes only a few minutes before he comes across the one thing he's managed to avoid all these years: Julia's old high school yearbook. The dark blue cover feels heavier than it should. He hesitates, his fingers tracing the familiar crest before finally taking a breath and opening it. Leafing through the pages, he's hit by a wave of memories. Hallways bright with voices, group photos at graduation, snapshots of kids holding up signs, goofy messages written in smudged ink. But none of it hits him as strongly as the sight of Julia's own senior picture. She looks right out from the page, her smile wide, her hair pulled back the way she wore it every day. Seeing her there, caught forever in that hopeful moment before everything changed, brings back the ache he'd been fighting to bury. He's about to close the book when his eyes wander to another face, one that used to be as familiar as Julia's, Emily Schneider, Julia's closest friend. Her picture is just below, and instantly Michael is carried back to laughter drifting through the hall, the sound of the girls' voices as they studied at the kitchen table or whispered secrets in Julia's room behind closed doors. It wasn't just a friendship. It was a kind of shared code, built from whispered promises and the safe feeling of belonging. Just as he prepares to move on, Michael notices a small note scribbled in the back pages, tucked away between good luck wishes and inside jokes. He reads, "Emily, thanks for lending me the secret garden again. Promise to return it soon. Don't let me forget." It's Julia's handwriting, easy to recognize from years of birthday cards. Somehow that casual reminder, a child's promise about a borrowed book, feels incredibly important. Michael looks across the room at Carol, a question in his eyes he cannot quite put into words. The note turns this whole painful project upside down. Until now, packing Julia's things felt final. But suddenly, he's caught by an old, restless urgency, the one that never quite quieted, to look closer, to dig into the everyday details for something bigger. Michael closes the yearbook, but his mind is spinning, quietly reigniting the need for answers he thought he'd finally given up. Michael can't seem to let it go. After reading the simple note about the secret garden, a book Julia and Emily had passed back and forth, he finds himself turning the room almost upside down. He checks every shelf, pulls boxes from under the bed, and even flips through old stacks of papers, looking for that illustrated edition. It would be easy to say it's just a children's story, just another object among dozens. But in the empty spaces Julia left behind, anything that carried her handwriting or memories feels more precious. The fact that the book is missing suddenly matters more than it probably should. Carol walks in as he's sitting on the floor, surrounded by a little chaos. Julia's scarves and hair clips are draped over the edge of the bed. A half-filled donation box sits open, and stacks of notebooks spill out across the rug. Carol pauses in the doorway. She takes in the mess. Her lips pressing together in that way Michael knows means she's holding things back. For a minute, neither of them says anything. The sound of the old grandfather clock downstairs marks the slow passing of time, mixing with the hush of distant waves. "Do you want help?" she finally asks, her voice soft, but her hands stay at her sides. Michael looks up, feeling the weight of her question isn't about the boxes or books. It's about whether they're really prepared to stir up all this again. For Carol, these objects are sharp reminders, and each one pulled out drags the old pain into the tired light of another afternoon. For Michael, though, with every drawer and carton he sifts through, he can't shake the sensation that he's supposed to find something, some tiny piece that might reveal a new truth or bring peace. They're both trying to get through the day in their own ways. Carol by letting go, Michael by digging deeper. For years they'd agreed, silently and out loud, that moving forward was the only option, but now that pact is trembling. Michael's sudden search resurrects hopes and questions Carol had forced herself to bury. The silent tension between them seeps into the walls, filling even the comfortable spaces with something brittle. Sometimes grief moves them together, and other times it pushes them further apart. Tonight it hangs quietly, leaving every room in the house just a bit heavier. Even after searching through every shelf and box in the house, Michael cannot shake the thought that there is still something out there, a small clue that might help him understand what happened to Julia all those years ago. The little note in Julia's handwriting, mentioning that borrowed book, feels like an invitation he cannot ignore. He knows Emily Schneider was the last person tied to that copy of The Secret Garden. They had been inseparable back then, but after Julia's disappearance, Emily had drifted away from everyone, especially Michael and Carol. Rumor had it she'd moved out to the far edge of town, living alone in an old trailer by the woods outside Cape Ann. On a grey Saturday morning, Michael starts down those winding, salt-worn roads that wrap around the coastline and head further north. Everything about the drive makes the distance between the past and present clearer than ever. The trees are bare at this time of year, their branches just scratching the sky, and the fog seems even thicker out here, hiding the town in layers until all that is left are distant memories and a hope that will not let go. Each mile brings a strange mix of anxiety and relief, as if moving toward Emily is not just about Julia's story, but also about finding his own forgiveness. When Michael finally pulls up to the faded blue trailer, he is nervous, but Emily steps out onto her porch before he even knocks. Her hair is streaked with grey now, and lines mark her cheeks and forehead. She looks instantly familiar, older of course, and a little wary, But when her eyes meet Michael's, he knows she recognizes the weight of this visit. There are no real greetings, only a shared pause, thick with the ache of everything that's come between them. "Emily," Michael says. He does not need to say more. At the mention of Julia's name, something softens between them, and the mourning that tangled their lives together rises to the surface. Time has not erased the old bond. They both still carry the grief in their postures and voices. For a long moment, neither of them speaks about missing years or regrets. Instead, in the chilly morning, there is just an almost silent promise to finally face whatever the past still holds, together if they are able. The silence between them is not empty this time, but filled with difficult hope. Inside the small but warm trailer, Michael takes in the familiar mismatched chairs, the way sunlight creeps in through the faded curtains, and the collection of old coffee mugs crowding the counter. Life has clearly been quiet out here, lived on Emily's own terms. She motions for Michael to sit at the crowded table, then disappears for a moment and returns clutching a worn, hardback book. The Secret Garden, its cover frayed, colors faded from years of handling. Emily sits down across from him and runs, her fingers over the embossed letters as if it might vanish if she lets go. "I've kept this all this time," she says quietly, glancing at Michael, her eyes guarded but honest. "Not because I couldn't return it. I guess I just needed to hold on to something that felt real from back then." Misplaced nostalgia turns out to be only half the truth. Emily hesitates, then confesses that for her, Julia was more than just a best friend. She was a kind of compass, and losing her had left a hole that could not be filled by anyone or anything else. The book became a physical link to everything. They had shared dreams, secrets, and even those silent moments when nothing needed to be explained. Michael carefully opens the cover. The first thing he notices is Julia's name, printed in neat, tidy script from her senior year. He flips a few pages, and a piece of paper slips out, fluttering to the table. They both watch as it lands face up, a torn magazine page used as a makeshift bookmark. On it is a photograph of Brian Callahan, a former classmate Michael barely remembers, but who, with that single image, is suddenly brought back to mind. For a second, the room feels crowded, not only with Julia's memory, but with others he had not thought about for years. Michael and Emily both stare at the picture, realizing that some memories had been all but erased until now. Emily explains that Brian was part of their group at the very end, always around, but rarely in the spotlight. The act of opening the old book for what seemed like closure instead opens up another layer of the story, pulling new connections into the open. With the return of the secret garden and that forgotten photo, what began as a simple act suddenly grows larger, shifting both of them gently toward questions and feelings neither had planned to face today. As Michael and Emily sit together in the comforting quiet of the trailer, the conversation naturally drifts deeper into the past, carried along by the weight of the memories that hang between them. The picture of Brian Callahan lying between them becomes the latest thread to pull. Michael remembers Brian as a bit of an outsider in Julia's circle, friendly enough, but never really part of the core group of friends. The stories at the table begin carefully, each memory unwrapped with hesitation, as if either of them could accidentally disturb something fragile. Emily leans back in her chair and sighs. "I know there were always rumors about Brian and Julia," she admits. "People said they might have been together, but honestly, I never saw anything like that." Her voice is steady, but there's something in the way she avoids Michael's gaze that makes him pay closer attention. He was always just there, around more often toward the end of senior year. Some people like to spread stories, but I always thought it was just talk. Michael sits with this, thinking back to conversations he and Carol once had about Julia's friends. For so many years, there were parts of Julia's life that remained mysterious, things she chose not to share. Back then, it didn't seem odd. Teenagers keep secrets after all. But now, after seeing the note in the yearbook, finding the book, and that photo falling out at just the right moment, Michael feels those secrets shifting in his mind. Suddenly, the gaps in what he knew about Julia seem huge, impossible to ignore. "So, you're sure nothing ever happened between you and Brian?" Michael asks gently, not wanting to accuse but needing to be certain. Emily shakes her head, a small, sad smile forming. "No, nothing like that. Julia was the connection. I barely talked to Brian if she wasn't around." Her words spark old doubts in Michael. Why, then, was Brian always close by? Was there something beneath the surface, a friendship or relationship they hadn't noticed? Michael wonders if either he or Carol ever really listened as closely as they should have, or if the investigators at the time overlooked some important thread. As these questions gather, the mystery that first felt so distant now grows more immediate. With each new piece of information, it seems less likely that what happened to Julia was simple or random. Instead, a different story is beginning to take shape, one that is just out of reach. Michael sits a long moment, letting everything Emily shared settle in. The gaps in Julia's story, once background static, now feel like spotlights revealing just how much he and Carol never knew. That photo of Brian, the rumors, and the unexplained nearness in those final months, all of it presses at Michael's mind until he can't ignore the urge to do something with these new threads. He looks at Emily, hesitating for a beat. Then asks quietly, "Do you know where Brian Callahan is now?" Emily nods, already reaching for her phone. "Actually, I heard about him at our last high school reunion. He showed up for the first time in years. Stayed just long enough to say hello and then ducked out early. A little awkward, but that was Brian, you know?" She scrolls through her contacts and finds a name and an address scrawled from an old group text, planning the reunion picnic near Lake Winthrop. She writes the address on the back of an envelope and passes it to Michael, her fingers shaking ever so slightly. He's in town. He never left for long. That one slip of paper puts purpose back in Michael's day. It's not like he expects clear answers or even a warm welcome, but after all the years of not knowing, he feels powerless to stop now. There's a pull in his chest, a force that isn't just hope, but determination, or maybe just a parent's stubbornness that refuses to surrender Julia's memory to silence. As he gets up to leave, Emily squeezes his hand, her expression full of understanding and worry. "Be careful, Mike. You're not the only one who's been trying to live with the past." He promises her he will, and thanks her more earnestly than he can put into words. Driving back through the winding roads, Michael knows Carol would beg him not to do this. She would say it's just picking at old scars that never truly healed, that all this digging only leads to pain. But Michael disagrees. He sees it not as refusing to forget, but as needing to know. He owes Julia that much. If there are answers somewhere, or even just the truth, he wants to find it no matter what it costs. In this moment, grief and resolve twist together, pushing him beyond what he ever thought he could do, even as the path grows darker and more uncertain ahead. Turning Emily's directions over in his mind, Michael drives across town, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and his thoughts jumbled with a mix of hope, dread, and stubbornness. He finds his way up the winding streets that lead to a part of Cape Ann full of large homes and manicured lawns. When he pulls up in front of Brian Callahan's house, he has to pause for a second to steady himself. The home is all glass and stone, with two shiny cars parked out front and flower beds so perfect they almost look fake. Michael rings the doorbell, and after a moment, Brian himself answers. He looks older than Michael remembers from the old school photos, but not by Much, just a little thicker around the middle, an expensive watch on his wrist, hair edged with silver. For a second, there's just awkward silence while Brian tries to place this unexpected visitor. Michael introduces himself, and as soon as he mentions Julia, or anything from way back, he sees a sudden shift in Brian's face. The friendly, polite air drains away and is replaced with a kind of stiff defensiveness. At first, Michael tries to keep things easy. He asks how Brian has been, whether he ever thinks about those school days, and casually brings up old friends. Brian dodges every question. He keeps glancing over Michael's shoulder as if someone else might be listening or watching. When Michael finally mentions Julia's name, Brian's posture goes rigid and his voice rises. "Look, that was a long time ago," Brian snaps. "I do not know what you want, but I have nothing to add. People move on, Michael. You should too." The directness of Brian's reaction unnerves Michael, but also fuels a deeper suspicion. Brian's insistence on shutting down the conversation is not just reluctance, it is almost like fear. The flash of anger, the way Brian's eyes dart around the room, and the forced calm in his voice all give away how uncomfortable he is. Michael thanks him for his time, trying to keep the exchange civil, but in his gut he knows there is more here than just old wounds. As he leaves, the feeling lingers that beneath all this wealth and calm, Brian is still carrying secrets that might finally explain those missing pieces in Julia's life. With every step away from that perfect house, Michael feels the weight of a new tension, another twist in the mystery that has refused to let him go. Michael leaves Brian's house, feeling more unsettled than ever. The tense conversation keeps replaying in his mind as he drives, aimlessly at first, letting quiet neighborhoods and tree-lined streets roll past his window. There is something about the way Brian shut him down, almost desperate to avoid even a hint of the past, that makes it impossible for Michael to let go. Without really thinking about it, he finds himself arriving at Whitman and Ford, the funeral planning place he and Carol sometimes drove by, but never had reason to enter. The weight of the years and unanswered questions presses on him, and, for a moment, planning something formal for Julia seems like it might be a step toward acceptance, even if it still feels impossible. Michael stares at the small, sunlit waiting area, thinking about what closure really means. Before he can bring himself to even get out of the car, something catches his eye across the street at Myers Hardware. Through the wide glass window, he spots Brian, hurried and a little flustered, buying what looks like a heavy shovel and a plain wooden box. Michael's first reaction is confusion. What sort of home improvement project would need that sort of gear all at once? But when he sees Brian move to the cash register and, almost as an afterthought, purchase a bouquet of lilies, the same flowers Julia always loved in their old garden, Michael goes cold. Every instinct screams that this is not a coincidence. When Brian finishes up and quickly loads the items into his car, Michael acts without even thinking. He ducks low in his seat until Brian drives off, then follows him at a careful distance, trying not to lose sight of those familiar taillights. As they wind through side streets and out past the edge of town, his heart pounds, torn between fear of what he might find and a deep need finally to understand. Every turn brings him further away from ordinary life and closer to the bitter truth he has always sensed, but never known. They leave the main road behind, heading toward old backcountry lanes that cut through swaths of forest and wetlands. Michael's world narrows to Brian's car, and the questions chasing them both. This choice to follow, to cross the invisible line between acceptance and confrontation, feels bigger than anything Michael has done in years, and he cannot help but sense that something at last is about to break through. Brian's car weaves its way down winding roads, finally taking a sharp turn onto a gravel lane Michael barely recognizes. This area is familiar. Years ago, he and Julia sometimes walked here to look out over the Atlantic from the headlands, a wild stretch where tides hammered stone and grass bent nearly sideways in the wind. Michael parks a safe distance away, ducking behind stands of spruce and pine as he follows on foot. He sticks to the shadows, nerves stretched tight as he watches Brian lug the shovel and wooden box toward a low, weathered cabin perched near the edge of the highest cliff above Marblehead Sound. Down by the old fence, Brian moves with a clumsy urgency, not seeming to notice anything but the task in front of him. He drops to his knees and begins digging, every clump of dirt landing with a hard thud. Michael huddles behind a thicket, the ocean's roar mixing with his racing thoughts. He cannot make out Brian's words, but he hears a steady stream, almost chanting, desperate. Occasionally, Brian glances up at the sky or glances toward the abyss, as if seeking approval for what he is about to do. After a while, Brian lowers the wooden box into the shallow hole and covers it with earth, patting it down almost frantically. Then he reaches for the lilies, arranging them over the spot, his fingers gentle but shaking. Just as Brian stands, a gust barrels in from the sea and sweeps several slips of paper from the box, sending them fluttering along the edge of the cliff. Michael crouches lower, watching as Brian scrambles after them, finally clutching one to his chest, head bowed. In that moment, the wind shifts and Michael hears it, Julia's name, spoken with a raw pain that slices through the years between then and now. The sound strikes Michael with such force he nearly stumbles out of hiding. Everything, the unanswered questions, the buried memories, Carol's hollow warnings, rush over him at once. The neat line between before and after is gone. Michael knows deep within that this is no ordinary memorial Brian is holding. This hidden ritual, the flowers, the box in the ground, all of it means that the secret he has been chasing is finally coming to the surface. There's no turning away from the truth now. Michael remains completely still, crouched behind a stand of brambles with one hand clamped over his mouth, trying to steady his breathing. The sight of Brian repeating Julia's name, the hurried way he buried the box, and the edge of the world setting give the whole moment a strange and dangerous feeling. Michael's heart hammers against his ribs, the weight of years of pain and longing pressing down on him, yet he does not dare reveal his presence. After a few minutes, Brian straightens up and surveys his surroundings, eyes sharp and cautious. He circles the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the trees and pausing now and then as if he senses something out of place. Michael shrinks further into the ground cover, willing himself to be invisible. Every time Brian's gaze sweeps his way, fear crawls up Michael's spine, twisting his insides. He wants desperately to know what is in that box, what was so important for Brian to hide here on this lonely cliff. But as much as he feels pulled forward by that need to know, there is also a cold warning in his mind. Any wrong move might be the last thing he ever does. Still, Michael watches as Brian finally heads back inside the cabin, casting one last look over his shoulder before the door slams shut. Waiting feels impossible. The tension is nearly too much to bear, but Michael forces himself to stay, hidden, counting slow breaths while the world quiets down, except for the wind and distant gulls. Then, when he is sure Brian has gone inside for good, Michael crawls toward the freshly disturbed patch of earth marked by lilies, hands shaking. He digs quickly, scooping dirt aside with trembling fingers until the box appears. The wood feels cool and unfamiliar, but Michael pries the lid open and peers inside, searching for answers through old letters, photographs, and scraps of Julia's handwriting mixed in with things he does not recognize. He barely has time to process the contents when suddenly heavy footsteps crash through the brush behind him. Michael freezes, the box half open. Brian bursts from the shadows, fury written all over his face, his voice ragged with fear and something like desperate determination. For a few seconds, time itself seems to hang between them. The truth of the past, all the pain and secrets, and the reality of this fraught moment. Michael knows there is no way to avoid what comes next. This confrontation, sharp and unavoidable, is where decades of guilt and silence collide head-on. Brian's eyes are wild, his shoulders squared as he stands just feet away from Michael, who still kneels beside the open box. The air crackles with everything unsaid between them, both men caught in the same storm of anger and regret. Brian, seeing the box pried open, rushes forward and shoves Michael's shoulder hard, sending him sprawling backward. Michael scrambles, up not letting go of the evidence, letters, old photos and mementos of Julia, some familiar and some chillingly new. Brian's voice shakes as he demands, "Put that back! You have no right here. You do not know what you are doing." Michael, barely able to catch his breath, shouts back, "I deserve to know the truth. I have spent years in the dark. You owe me that much." The argument grows sharp and raw, voices carrying out toward the sea. Brian's tone is pleading one second, threatening the next. It is like watching a man teeter between justifying himself and falling apart. With a sudden surge, Brian grabs for the box again, nearly wresting it free. In the chaos, Michael's phone slides out of his coat pocket and lands in the dirt. In a frantic move, Michael fumbles for it, his fingers finding the emergency SOS function, the one Carol insisted he set up years ago after Julia vanished. With Brian's hands gripping his sleeves, Michael manages to trigger the alarm, sending out his location, praying help is close. The effort costs him a bruised shoulder and a ringing in his head, but he does not let go. As the struggle drags on, Brian's voice cracks into desperate confessions. He blurts out half-formed accusations against Julia, shouting that she was obsessed, that she betrayed him, that he had no choice. Tears streak down his face, fury and grief tangled in every word. Michael, torn between understanding and disgust, tries to reason with him, even as Brian becomes more frantic. It is not even clear who he is angry at anymore. Maybe himself, maybe Julia, maybe everyone. The standoff threatens to tip out of control, but through the din, a break, the distant sound of sirens. Within seconds, blue and red lights strobe through the trees. State troopers sprint across the clearing, voices commanding and clear. The tension snaps. In a blur of confusion, Brian collapses, sobbing, while Michael moves aside, exhausted and shaking. Suddenly, the secret they both carried is no longer private. Now the entire world is coming to bear witness. The woods around the old cabin fill quickly with state troopers and detectives, their vehicles parked in every direction with lights flashing through the branches. Brian, now cuffed and slumped against a patrol car, is silent for the first time all evening. Michael, still breathing hard, finds himself surrounded by officers asking questions. He does his best to answer, his hands shaking as he explains everything that brought him here, from the unease he felt in Brian's house to the odd purchases, and finally to this wild scene atop the cliffs of Marblehead Sound. For the first time in years, he feels a strange kind of relief, as though the ground beneath his feet is finally solid again. Almost immediately, investigators focus on the box Michael dug up. A pair of evidence technicians place it carefully into a protective bag, then open it under the glare of flashlights. Inside, rows of letters wrapped with twine, yellowed photos of Julia smiling at places Michael barely recognizes, and several handwritten notes spill out. The contents are carefully catalogued, the air heavy with an unspoken sense of dread and anticipation. Each document is handled like a piece of a puzzle that everyone in the squad room wants solved. Detective Linda Carter, who leads the forensics team, sits down near Michael on the back bumper of a squad car and quietly walks him through some of the discoveries. The letters paint a picture he never expected. Julia's script is painfully familiar, gentle and deeply personal, but woven through her messages is the sense of something darker, desperate attempts to fix Brian's problems, messages filled with apologies she should not have had to make, and pleas for understanding that often go unanswered. In reply, Brian's notes are erratic, sometimes loving, sometimes angry, his words twisting between blame and need. The more Linda reads, the clearer the truth becomes. Julia was trapped in something that looked, at a distance, like love, but up close was full of control and manipulation. She hung on to hope that Brian might change, that things could heal, but her letters reveal loneliness and exhaustion. Michael listens as the detective outlines what the team has begun to piece together, a secret relationship that veered off into obsession, leaving Julia lost between helping someone she cared about and trying to save herself. With every new document, Michael feels shock and heartbreak, but also a quiet validation of the suspicions that have haunted him all these years. As the contents of the box keep coming, the entire crime scene feels heavier, like the woods themselves are holding their breath. Michael sits on the bumper of a squad car, numb at first, as the technicians and detectives work through the growing pile of evidence. He tries not to look, but everywhere he glances there are photographs that tell the story in ways words never could. Pictures of Julia with forced, brittle smiles, standing next to Brian in places and poses that she never shared with Michael or anyone from their old life. Detective Carter sits across from him, sorting through stacks of handwritten notes and photocopied documents. She pauses more than once, shaking her head at the damning details in front of her. Among the letters are pages of desperate apologies written by Julia, promising just one more chance, some with instructions or threats from Brian scribbled in. The margin. There are diaries filled with frantic entries, full of fear and hope tangled together, along with long, rambling rants from Brian, sometimes raging at Julia and sometimes blaming everyone else. It is not just the words. In the bottom of the box, the team pulls out photographs Julia probably never wanted anyone to see, images that make Michael feel sick, but which confirm the controlling, abusive grip Brian had over her. Detective Carter reads a few more lines. Aloud, notes from Brian threatening to hurt himself if Julia left, swearing over and over that he would change, making the same promises that circle back broken every time. The investigators handle these pages with extra care, bagging each one as evidence. But Michael sees it all, and with every new reveal, any notion he had that Julia was the one at fault just crumbles away. For Michael, it is more than just the pain of losing Julia all over again. Seeing these details, he cannot escape the thought that silence, his, the family's, even the teachers and neighbors who might have seen something, played its part too. If only someone had pressed harder, asked twice, or refused to let her hide so much. The knowledge is sharp, but brings with it a type of relief. All the pieces finally make sense, even if they hurt. Michael feels his grief shift into something steadier, a will to tell everyone what really happened and to fight for justice for Julia, no matter how long it takes. The truth, however brutal, will finally come into the light. With the main evidence laid out under the watchful eyes of the police, emotions run high. But the search around the old cabin presses on. Michael stays close as the state troopers and forensic teams sweep the rocky ground nearby, sectioning off the earth where fresh disturbances suggest something hidden. It starts with a single officer kneeling and calling for a supervisor after finding what looks like the corner of a faded scarf. From there, everything changes. Little by little, law enforcement begins to uncover belongings that Michael knows too well. There's a compact mirror Julia always carried, still holding a few strands of her hair inside. A silver ring, a birthday present from years before, glimmers under the harsh light of the forensics lantern. Each item feels like it has been plucked from Michael's memory and placed impossibly in the cold soil beneath the cabin. He stands with Detective Carter and a few others, eyes burning, as gloved hands carefully brush dirt from objects that meant everything to Julia. No one says much. The scene is too heavy for ordinary words. When the first pieces of bone are found, there is a silence that settles over the group. Officers mark the spot, setting up thicker tape and lowering their voices. This is no longer just a missing person investigation. The process is deliberate, slow, and deeply respectful. Medical examiners record placements, take photos, and remove each, a fragment with as much care as possible. Michael refuses to leave, even as some of the search team suggests he sit down or wait in a cruiser. He stands firm, feeling that he owes Julia his quiet presence for as long as she is here. He once promised himself and her in unspoken moments long ago that he would not stop searching until the truth emerged. With every artifact brought up, Michael's sense of heartbreak and obligation swirl together. There is pain in seeing what is left, in watching the end of years of hope, but also something close to peace. This is the confirmation he has dreaded and needed all at once. When the final piece is bagged and tagged, Michael stands in the fading daylight, both emptied and strangely relieved. The hardest part of not knowing is finally over. All that remains now is to face what was lost and see that justice, however delayed, is finally set in motion. Not long after the sun starts its slow melt into the horizon, Carol and Tom pull up in Carol's old Ford, headlights flashing against the police tape that waves in the September breeze. They move slowly, as if walking, through water, their faces worn from too many restless nights and long, haunting days. The news about the remains found has already hit them hard, and now being here, so close to the truth, so close to Julia, makes grief settle heavy in their bones. Michael spots them near the edge of the taped-off area. Without a word, they draw closer, forming a rough circle at the cliff's edge that once meant childhood summer barbecues and laughter, now haunted by what they have learned. There are no long embraces or dramatic displays. Instead, the three just stand side by side, shoulders nearly touching, and look out over the water where the wind churns up white foam among the rocks. The silence that passes between them says more than grief ever could, stitching them together in a way that only shared loss can. Tom's jaw trembles as he looks at Michael, but it is Carol who finally breaks the hush. "We need to bring her home," she says quietly, her voice thin but steady. "She deserves better than this place." Everyone nods in agreement. Carol's determination cuts through the fog of emotion, giving the moment purpose. She shares a look with Detective Carter, who steps a little closer and assures her that Julia's remains will not stay here. The team will proceed with all the care possible, and Carol's wishes will guide the process. There is no question now. This family, battered as it is, will see Julia finally laid to rest with dignity. For several minutes, they remain like that, silent, holding on to one another's presence, grounded against the ache of all the questions that will go unanswered. In the background, police and forensics teams work with quiet respect, voices lowered and movements gentle. With the investigation shifting to its next stage, this brief gathering at the cliff becomes a ceremony of sorts. A goodbye that they all share, one none of them ever wanted, but each knows they need. Here, on this windswept bluff, they begin to craft space for something new, a kind of mourning that mixes heartbreak with the beginning of justice and a pledge to honor Julia in every way they have left. A few days later, in a quiet corner of Marblehead's main beach, the farewell everyone hoped would never come finally arrives. The sky hangs soft and pale overhead. Neighbors, friends from Julia's old school, teachers who still remember her laughter in the halls, and family drift together on the sand as morning fog slips away. This gathering is not large or showy, just a tight circle of people who shared pieces of Julia's journey, each holding their own memories. Michael stands beside Carol, both of them holding hands tight. By their side is Tom, whose face is etched with an exhaustion that will take years to fade. but also with the relief that his daughter has finally been returned to the world in a way that feels kind. At the center of the group sits a simple wooden urn, polished smooth, holding all that is left of the girl who once could not wait to swim out past the buoys. Detective Carter stays respectfully in the back, along with a few officers, having become part of this strange family over the past week. Everyone waits for the right moment, but it is Carol who steps forward, cradling the urn in her arms and wades into the gentle surf. One by one, people follow, bringing handfuls of white daisies, chrysanthemums, and roses, letting them float on the water where the tide will carry them. Carol tips the urn and, with a deep breath, lets the ashes scatter. They swirl in the blue, mingling with the flowers and sunlight, drifting out toward the horizon Julia always loved. As the group stands quietly, old classmates trade hugs and small stories. Teachers share glances that admit the regrets they still carry. There is no hiding that they all wonder if things could have been different had someone noticed more or spoken up sooner. Tom stands a little apart, reaching into the bag at his side for a battered copy of The Secret Garden, worn from years of being passed between Julia and her closest friend, Sarah. With a soft whisper, Sarah thanks Julia for all the laughter and adventure, then lets the book float out with the flowers, a last gift and goodbye. No one rushes to leave. For a while, the crowd simply watches as tides and memories claim Julia's story, letting sorrow and love mingle just as she would have wanted. After the last of the flowers disappeared on the tide, people slowly drifted away in small, quiet groups. Michael and Carol remained close, sharing nervous glances as they waited by the old dunes where their car was parked. Just as the crowd had nearly gone, Detective Carter walked up to them, her manner gentle but serious. The air smelled of salt and summer grass, but the heaviness had not lifted yet. Detective Carter took a moment, looking out at the water before turning to face Julia's parents. Her eyes were kind, but there was no easy way to soften what she had to say. "I wanted you both to know," she started, "that Brian gave a full confession last night at headquarters in Boston. He explained everything. He could not accept that Julia wanted out of the relationship. When she tried to cut things off and make a new start, he brought her to the cabin. He kept her there, hoping to convince her to hide away with him and pretend. She had left on her own. She refused, and that's when things took a bad turn. There was a struggle and—" She looked down, her words trailing off, allowing Michael and Carol to fill in the rest for themselves. The truth, after so much waiting, had finally found all its pieces. For a long moment, the only noise was the breeze brushing through the grass. No one cried, not right then. There did not seem to be any tears left. Sarah, who stood a little apart, joined the family in the sand, her face drawn with regret. "I should have noticed something was off," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "I should have realized what Julia was facing. I missed all the signs." Carol reached for Sarah's hand and squeezed it. "No, honey, none of this was your fault," she answered softly, her voice gentle. "That boy worked hard to keep us all in the dark. He found ways to separate Julia from everyone who loved her, and we missed it. If anything, it shows how far someone like that can go to isolate and control another person." As the sun lingered over the ocean and the waves rolled on, that final, brutal clarity brought wounds, but also a certain peace. By letting Julia return to the sea, they found a sense of closure carved out of their scars, making room for healing, even if it would take a lifetime to come. As the day comes to a close and the colors of the sky start to blend into soft purples and golds, Michael and Carol return to their house by the water. The rooms are quiet, full of all the small things that Julia touched. A scarf tossed over a chair, books half read on a shelf, photos tucked along the edge of the mirror. Neither one rushes to turn on the lights. Instead, they move together. to the living room, settling into the worn old couch where family movie nights and sleepy Sunday mornings used to happen. A box sits on the coffee table, full of old pictures and letters. Michael opens it, and they leaf through photographs taken over the years. Some are from birthday parties, others from forgotten road trips along the coast, and some from afternoons spent building sandcastles on the beach out front. There is Julia. At 8, her hair wild and her smile wide, and Julia at 16, dancing into the waves with Sarah close behind. Looking at these pictures now carries a different kind of weight, a feeling that isn't just ache, but something gentler, touched by relief that the worst uncertainty is finally gone. Outside, the sun dips lower, casting a golden ribbon across the water. Michael glances at Carol, and for the first time in what feels like forever, their shared silence feels peaceful, not heavy. It gives room for the words they have both needed to say, but could never quite speak out loud, while mystery and hope still tangled them up. They start to talk, quiet at first, then stronger. They talk through memories, through the fear and anger, and into the moments when they both wished they could have done more. Still, the conversation shifts. They remember Julia not only for her struggle, but for the laughter she brought, her fierce loyalty, and the way she could make something beautiful out of almost anything. They let themselves cry, but also laugh at some of the sillier stories that bubble up. In this new light, grief becomes gentler, balanced by gratitude. They promise each other that from now on, Julia's name will be said with joy just as much as with sadness. And as the sun finally disappears into the sea, Michael and Carol know their journey is far from over, but at least now they will walk it together, carrying Julia's spirit forward with love and hope. As the night settles in, a soft hush falls over the house. Michael finds himself standing by the bookshelf, fingers brushing absent-mindedly over Julia's old high school yearbook. It strikes him all over again how something as simple and everyday as a yearbook started everything, a plain object, almost forgotten, that wound up untangling a web of secrets and silence nobody had wanted to face. He remembers the afternoon, not so long ago, when he sat at this very table and flipped open those worn pages, desperate for any clue to what had happened, hoping beyond hope that some small detail would tell him where to look next. Now, all of that seems like a different lifetime. The desperate searching, the long, lonely nights pacing the porch, the impossible cycle of hope and doubt. It is behind them, even if the sadness lingers. What began as a chase for answers has finally come to an end, and what is left is quieter, but no less real. Michael and Carol sit together side by side. They have moved their chairs closer without realizing it, and the closeness feels natural, comforting in the stillness of their home. On the coffee table lies a photo of Julia, her arms flung wide as she runs through a spray of salt water, laughing so freely that Michael can almost hear the sound in his memory. It is this version of Julia they will hold on to, the girl full of light and courage and warmth, not the shadow that was left behind by everything they have learned. Something feels different now, with the truth no longer hidden or glossed over, with the whole town having come together to mourn and remember Julia openly. Their grief has become something they can share, something that no longer needs to be kept behind closed doors. They speak her name without hesitation, holding all the stories and jokes and small joys up to the light where others can see them too. Michael lets his gaze rest on that photo a while longer, the room filling with an easy silence. He and Carol both sense it. They are no longer trapped by unknowing. Love, battered but never broken, sits with them quietly. Julia is not lost in the cold unknown anymore. She is home, surrounded by the words, actions, and affection of those who never stopped searching, even when it hurt the most.